Okay, I think we should get going, given that this is we're just getting going with the morning time here in Boston, the United States, and perhaps getting ready for dinner in India on June 15, 2023. It's a real pleasure to see all of you, or at least know that all of you are here and see our fellow speakers and panelists. Welcome to our symposium series. This is the first of several symposia that we are going to be organizing over the course of this year. The series is called Invest in India, Invest in the World. My name is Bhaskar Chakravorti. I'm the Dean of Global Business here at Fletcher. I join my dear colleague, Dean Rachel Kyte, Dean of the Fletcher School, in welcoming all of you to this series that we are organizing over the course of this year, which is the 90th year of the founding of the Fletcher School as the first purely graduate school of global affairs in the United States, and regularly counted as the few handful of preeminent centers where these kinds of complex conversations that affect the world are held. We are jointly hosting this symposium series with three research centers at Fletcher: the Center for International Environmental and Resource Policy, the Lair Institute for Migration and Human Security, and the Institute for Business in the Global Context, where we bring together a series of topics that are pressing not only for India, but for the world. And we started this conversation as a smaller conversation among a group of us on the Fletcher faculty: Karen Jacobson, Eileen Babbitt, Kim Wilson, and myself, and eventually brought in Rachel into this discussion as well, where we recognized that over and over again, as we start discussing a variety of topics as they relate to the world, in our classrooms, in our research, in our conferences, the example of India keeps returning over and over again. India comes in as a case study. India comes in as an illustration. India comes in as a model for the world to learn from. And sometimes it's a model to potentially use as a point of departure. So we realize that, of course, what is happening in India is extraordinary. What's happening in India is extraordinary, not just for India, but it's actually extraordinary for the world. So what better time than to launch into this discussion on a series of topics that are universal. And of course, there's a lot going on in India on these issues. We launched the Fletcher School 90 years back at a time when the world was retreating into its individual corners. Every nation was out for itself. Essentially, we were in between two world wars, staring into the abyss of the Great Depression. And Fletcher was founded with the idea of advancing the prosperity and stability of an increasingly globalized society. This was a time when no one was talking about globalization. John Maynard Keynes, in fact, recommended everybody should retreat to their corners. And this is the essence of the Fletcher School, which is go along, and eventually the rest of the world is going to follow you. We are in a different world today. We are in a globalized society that is re-examining that globalization. And India stands at the crossroads at a lot of that re-examination and creation of new ideas and innovation. So today's topic is on the subject of climate action, sustainable development, and the potential trade-offs or maybe complementarities between development and sustainability. We have several other topics coming up in the future episodes of the series. The next one will be on digital public infrastructure, the one after that on urbanization and migration and the demographic dividend. And the last one is on geopolitics and India at the intersection of not just the India-China dynamic, but various other geopolitical crossroads. So I'm joined today by my good friend and renowned business leader and investor and a public intellectual, Gaurav Dalmia, who is the chairman of the Dalmia Group Holdings. And he and I will moderate a conversation with an extraordinary panel. If I were to pick three people, from India, the world, and from Fletcher to talk about climate action and sustainability, I couldn't have picked three, more redoubtable individuals. We have Amitabh Kant, who's the G20 Sherpa for India, former head of NITI Aayog. We have William Bissell, who's the chair of Fabindia, and William, I'm pandering to my fellow panelists by wearing one of your products, and Rachel Kyte, Dean of the Fletcher School. Our conversation is going to be about climate action and sustainability. I will turn this over to Gaurav to lead us off with, the conversation, and I'll pipe in wherever I find an opportunity. This is going to be an organic discussion. We will have a few questions to guide the conversation, and then we'll open this up for the audience to weigh in with their observations and certainly questions for our participants. Gaurav.
Thank you, Bhaskar. So I will start by making one comment, and then perhaps I'll ask two questions. My comment is that the environmentalist Robert Swan famously said that the biggest challenge facing the world today is the belief that someone else will change it. The sustainability challenge that we all face needs to be addressed at all levels, at the personal level, at a business level, at a social or government level. There are actions that we can take personally. For instance, if we all decided to reduce meat consumption to once or twice a week, it'll help the climate efforts. Yet few people do it. My first question is to William Bissell. So William, individual behaviors are driven by incentives and beliefs and assumptions and contexts. Do you see a need for incentives or regulations that lead to behavior change at the individual level, at scale? Are there any examples that come to your mind?
So thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you, Gaurav. It's great to be here. I think that one of the pressing issues facing us is calling for a systemic rethinking. I think that as Prime Minister Modi has often spoken about it, is that the global order that was created at the end of the Second World War, notably with a series of declarations at Bretton Woods and the Bretton Woods institutions that came out of it, have created these global institutions have, I think, served the world well in the post-war reconstruction and period. But as the world order, is in a period of, a paradigm shift change, with hundreds of millions of new consumers entering the market, and those consumers have a right, they believe, and the leaderships in their respective countries also feel that those consumers need now to start living a middle-class life with all the ramifications of what a middle-class life involves. And I think that what it's going to do is that, as Mahatma Gandhi famously once was supposed to have said, is the world has enough for everybody's needs, but not for everybody's greed. And I think that the problem that's staring us in the faces is, as India adds, and hopefully India will be successful in adding 600 million to the middle class in the next decade and a half, with the economic policies and the huge push for infrastructure that the government is following. If that were to happen, and China has already added close to 600 million to the global middle class, there is going to be a resource constraint and a resource allocation issue that is going to be staring politicians of every country, of every nation. And it's going to call on politicians to do exceptional things, which is to really rethink the order in which we are and the system of pricing and incentives that is currently in place today. And while there have been a number of commendable, as Dean Kyte, as you said just before we started this session, there has been a lot of talk and a lot of good ideas circulating, but there's very little to show for it right now on the ground. And I think that the need of the hour is to really relook at the quality of incentives that we have in place, starting with creating funds for countries to leapfrog technologies. I mean, that has been a subject of discussion for the last 20 years. We've been hearing about it from one climate change conference to the other, but to set up a serious fund with several $1 trillion in it to help countries leapfrog, to even insisting that local governments implement energy savings and develop pathways. I mean, this is a mammoth task before think tanks, institutions, and politicians. And I think that institutions like the Fletcher School can lead the way in putting together a framework of what an order like that would look like. Because after all, you are an intellectual institution. You do function as a think tank. You train some of America's finest, and globally, some of the finest diplomats have been to the Fletcher School. So this is a place really to incubate these ideas. And if you start with, there are a number of terrific ideas out there, but they all have to do with the transfer of wealth from the richer countries in the world to the developing world. And I think that the institutions for that transfer and the funds that need to be created, it requires a rewriting of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IFC and other institutions, to creating institutions that are enabling institutions to let countries in Africa and Asia move quickly up a developmental path, but one that uses a fraction of the carbon that the Western world used when it embarked on its developing path. And if there's one single idea that I'd like to leave you with, it's this, that one of the things that I noticed missing from debates is when a developing country is castigated for its carbon use, one needs to look at what the carbon is being used for. If the carbon is being used to create much needed employment for communities that don't have it, versus that the carbon is being used to fund a Ryanair and EasyJet to fly people around Europe for 30 or 40 pounds a seat to vacation homes in other parts of the, we have to come up with some subjective means of pushing capitalism in a direction of looking at subjective outcomes rather than just objective outcomes. Because I think that part of the carbon usage of the future is going to have to be for developing countries to realize their aspirations. And these aspirations are important. These aspirations are part of the national promise that their leaders make to the citizens in those countries. And to deny those countries these aspirations is, in my opinion, a human rights tragedy. So we have to balance, and it will come to countries like India, China, and the US working together to create the new post-Bretton Woods international order that looks at these things. Because the Bretton Woods institutions were designed for a reconstruction post a devastating war. And today we have a different kind of reconstruction ahead of us, which will require different institutions.
Thank you, William. The second part of my question is transitioning from the individual to an economy-wide level. So let's consider China. Recently, Bloomberg had a report which said that China can hit net zero by 2050. But the price tag will be an enormous $38 trillion. Question for Dean Kyte: what might be the political drivers for making this happen? How will such large numbers get financed, you think?
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say that it's a great honor to be on the screen with Amitabh Kant, but also with you, Mr. Bissell. When I first moved to the subcontinent, I moved to Bangladesh. I finished my first house with Fabindia, and I continue to do that all the way through my career. So just a little fangirl moment at the beginning of this webinar. So I think just to build off the comments that have just been made, we should not be naive. There is an enormous industry that spends a lot of its time making sure that we all think that this is about individual personal choice and change. And of course it is, but it is about systems change, as William said. And there's a lot of evidence, including that published by Naomi Oreskes at Harvard just down the road, that shows how much money has gone into advertising, marketing, and misinformation campaigns to make sure that individuals think that this is about their individual change, and therefore it's impossible to imagine that we can all change as much as we need to. So let's go back to those systems changes, right? Well, obviously it's the energy system, but it goes far beyond that. It's also the food system, and it's the financial system, and everything that then feeds off or lives off the energy system, the financial system. And then so there is a pathway, there's a clearly navigated pathway to net zero. And when we see numbers like $38 trillion for China, we talk about the need for $2 to $2.8 trillion worth of investment in green infrastructure in emerging markets alone every year until 2030. Then people sort of sit back and think, oh goodness, those are really unobtainable numbers. and therefore, we really are in a dilemma, except that we're still spending $1.5 trillion a year on harmful fossil fuel subsidies, and we're spending almost $1 trillion in harmful food subsidies every year. So there is misdirection within the economy, and the signals are not consistent. If we can get those signals consistent, then I think that there is a lot we can do. So, for example, when we think about the investments that China is still putting in to coal-fired power generation, and the fact that if all of those coal-fired power plants are built and then operated, that would push the world well past its 1.5 degree target, its net zero commitment. Inside the politics of all of that is that many of those coal-fired power plants are actually construction projects, not power generation projects, because in China, just as everywhere else in the world, it is cheaper to run on renewables. Obviously, that depends on having the grid infrastructure available to evacuate the power from generation. And in many cases, that isn't available, and that pushes the price up. But for the Chinese, it makes no sense for them to actually operate those coal-fired power plants at full throttle. Now, within their political system, they will have to manage a set of construction projects that won't actually generate fuel. They have to manage the investment in their own grid infrastructure. But we know that that the transition is underway. It has taken us 22 years as a global community to go from 1 gigawatt to 1 terawatt of installed solar energy generation. It is predicted that it will take us only 5 years to go to the 2nd and 3rd terawatts. China will have 1 terawatt of installed solar for its own account, just for China, by 2027. Now, rather than sort of talking about the costs and how prohibitive they are, because I don't think they are, I think the investment is possible and is there. What we do need to be talking about is the advice, the institutions, and the investment in the grid infrastructure to be able to cope with the renewable energy revolution, which is already underway. And then, as you mentioned in your question, and as William mentioned in his answer, we have to then find the funding to make sure that that happens worldwide, and that this isn't just a green revolution in rich countries or countries that can print money, or countries that can build the component parts of that solar or wind or any other modern renewable value chain. I think we may get onto transport and electric vehicles further on in the conversation, but I think that some of the numbers there would also show that when there is consistency of regulatory signals, and when it is clear how countries are planning to manage their transition to net zero, then the response of the industry and the investment actually comes alongside. So I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. There are enormous challenges. We haven't got that kind of finance mobilized at the moment. That is why India's presidency of the G20 is so important this year, and that there's so much sort of conversation going on about using the finance that's already available in a much better, much more aggressive, and a higher risk-taking way, solving some of the structural barriers that mean that the cost of capital is far too high for far too many countries, and then making sure that the incentives are right for the kinds of investments we want to see, coping with a new era of green industrial policy, coping with what that might mean for the trade regime. So we're not at all, by any stretch of the imagination, out of the woods, but I think we can depict a path forward. And I don't actually think that money is the problem. I actually think that managing the politics and making sure that the policy, the institutions are running ahead of the money is as big a problem.
Great, thank you, Rachel and William, for kicking us off in this conversation. And let's pivot from China, which of course is a lot to dig into there. But let's go from China to India. As we know, China and the United States are the top 2 emitters of greenhouse gases. India's number 3. And collectively, the three countries contribute just above 42% of total global emissions. That's one interesting, important statistic, but puts India in a very special club. But when you deflate those greenhouse gases with population, India drops out on a per capita basis. India is, much further down as greenhouse gas emitter per capita. So that puts India in a very, somewhat different spot. And coming back to a point I think that William made earlier, which is, when you're a developing country, what are you using that carbon for? And are you using it to go to vacation homes in the south of Europe, or are you using it for development? So there is a question of trade-off that needs to be discussed. But the reality right now is globally, land temperatures are up at least 1.6 degrees centigrade since pre-industrialization times. But in India, many of the cities are up 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. And India's net zero commitment horizon goes out to 2070. And the question that I have for Amitabh is, do you foresee scenarios for India getting to that target, A, getting to that target, but B, perhaps getting to that target even earlier? In fact, the International Renewable Energy Agency Director General, Francesco La Camera, had predicted that India is going to get to the target much earlier. And I'm curious about the perspective that Amitabh, you have from your vantage point in terms of the actions that India is taking today, and how you foresee that net zero horizon potentially being shortened for India.
So thank you, Bhaskar. Let me first say that India is not responsible for carbonizing the world. If you look at the total carbon space available on a per capita income basis, India has occupied just about 2.5% of the total carbon space. But as it industrializes in due course, it will carbonize the world. But the challenge for a country like India is that irrespective of what it has contributed or not contributed, it must become the first country in the world to industrialize without carbonizing the world. And therefore, it has pursued a very ambitious policy. And we are the only G20 country which actually achieved its NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. We've done about 175 gigawatt of renewable energy. We've pushing for renewables in a very big way. The Prime Minister at COP26 had announced the ambitious goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2070 as part of the Panch Amrits to address climate change. He laid down 5 clear goals. And this, to my mind, the challenge is that we can keep doing more and more renewables, but even if we are to do about 100% of our electricity as renewable electricity, it's not electricity, because electricity is only 20% of your energy. The balance 80% is hard to abate sectors. And these are where it's not electricity which makes a difference, but it's other forms of energy. So you look at refinery, you look at steel, you look at cement, you look at fertilizer, you look at long distance transport. It's very important to decarbonize these. And this, to my mind, would require us to move from fossil fuel. And India imports about $200 billion worth of gas and coal and cooking coal. And we also import a lot of energy, which needs to shift. And India's Prime Minister said that by 2047, by the time it becomes 100, actually it should not be importing energy, but should be exporting energy. And that would require that India becomes the producer and the champion of green hydrogen. And therefore, India is climatically blessed. It has got top-class entrepreneurship. Many of the young entrepreneurs have done remarkable work in the field of climate. Their ambitions are enormous. So India's cross-sectoral decarbonization priorities in sectors such as power generation, railways, all the hard-to-abate sectors, alongside its recent success in low-cost RE deployment, they've ushered in a huge, huge confidence towards our climate ambition. I really believe that there are 4 key pillars on which my optimism is based. Achieving accelerated progress deployment in these 4 areas will really play a pivotal role in deciding India's transition to a net zero economy by 2070 or before that. Firstly is our ability to tap into India's offshore wind and bioenergy potential, a very comprehensive national green hydrogen strategy, which is now being driven actually on ground. Many entrepreneurs have pushed this. Our decarbonization, our industrial decarbonization targets, iron and steel and cement, and a very diversified energy storage mechanism, that is pump storage, because pump storage gives you the ability to store energy for over, it's a 40% cheaper than battery storage. It gives you a 100-year lifespan, unlike lithium batteries, which will give you 8 or 9 years. And it's being pushed in a very big way by young entrepreneurship. Now, the challenge as I see is that if you look around the world, there's no shortage of resources. That there are $350 trillion worth of resources available with the private sector. Almost about $150 trillion are available with sovereign wealth fund, pension funds, etc. But the risk-reward returns are very different in emerging markets as compared to developed markets. And therefore, you need, as rightly William said, that these institutions were created in the post-World War II period. They were not designed for both sustainable development goals and for climate change. So these institutions do not do any indirect lending, they only do direct lending. You need much greater level of ability to do blended finance. You need first loss guarantees, you need credit enhancement. All that should enable institutions like World Bank actually to do 20x lending of what they do presently. So there's no shortage of finance. There is a shortage of our inability to make private capital flow into emerging markets. Now, most of the growth in the coming decades will come from emerging markets. It will not come from developed part of the world. And therefore, you need long-term resources to flow into these markets to enable countries like India to move to net zero much quicker, much faster. I'm not worried so much about technology because the past decade has demonstrated that India's entrepreneurship is really dynamic. They have the capability and the capacity to get the best technology in the world. I don't think there should be government-to-government technology and all that. The private sector is well equipped. So many of our private enterprises are actually leading the net zero charge as well. If you look at a whole range of new entrepreneurs which have driven green hydrogen, many of them have driven renewables. Infosys has achieved net zero in 2020 itself. Wipro is committed to net zero by 2045. You look at all the top enterprises, they've pushed for a huge transition. India's railway will be 2030 net zero. It's moving totally towards electric. So as with India's economic transformation, India's pathway to net zero will also be driven by the private sector, but it will require long-term financing in a very big way. And that financing today is not, you'll need instruments which will enable India's private sector to get 30 years, 35 years lending at very low cost. The hedging costs are very, very high. You do not get instruments beyond 3 to 4 years. And that leads to very high cost of long-term financing into completely new sectors of growth and to use new energy and the cleaner forms of energy. And therefore, my view is that India is geared to do this. India is dynamic enough to do this. India is climatically blessed. India's private sector is dynamic, but the world should ensure that there are better instruments, and the multilateral development banks need to be restructured in a manner where they'll enable much more private sector to flow in for a much longer period to enable India's transformation to take place and enable India to push for net zero much quicker, much faster.
Thank you, Amitabh. That is heartening to hear. So thank you for your insights. I'll turn this over to Gaurav.
So, William, a question for you. From your book, you mentioned right scaling in your book. Can you give a few examples on how we can right scale for sustainability? And is there an Indian model for striking a balance between the needs of economic and social development and the sustainable use of natural resources? So we'll welcome your views.
Thanks. Thank you, Gaurav. One of the ways to accelerate renewal projects where we look at means by which we can reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is forestry. And forestry has been something that the current government has made a key focus area. And I think the last mile connect there, if as Amitabh was saying, if we can figure out a way to incentivize entrepreneurs, especially at the local level, to work on regenerating forests. Currently, there are large tracts of land which are where forests have been denuded and have to be replaced. And if there's a way of measuring that, which is now easier to do with the technologies that we have, and incentivizing local communities and creating a fund, this would go a long way towards generating massive amount of rural employment, which is needed. It will slow down the rural to urban migration. It will create meaningful jobs, which are not in the agricultural sector, in the rural areas, which is where the need is. Today, the order of magnitude is close to 20 million jobs a year. It will also regenerate very powerfully areas of the country where forest resources have been denuded, and give the local people a say in how they manage their own resources. The other thing is the forest resources in India are inextricably linked to our watersheds. And I'm just struck being in Connecticut at the moment at how carefully watersheds are managed in this state, because watersheds are part of the reservoir system that feeds all the local communities with clean drinking water. And if a similar kind of model were introduced where local water resources were transferred to the panchayats, which is the last level of government, and the district level, it would lead to a revolutionary change in how watersheds are managed, because in India, forests and water have a very intimate connection. And as forests get denuded, the watersheds get damaged, and then the land's ability to hold the water changes. So just with one simple set of policy initiatives, you could actually accomplish 4 very, very key objectives. One is rural employment. The other thing is sequestering the carbon in the atmosphere through the forests. The third is providing strong local water resources, because one of the issues that is going to be frequented with climate change across the world, we are seeing it everywhere, is droughts, frequent droughts. This would build a reservoir system in local areas, and also maybe create a water exchange. India has a very dynamic Minister of Water Resources. The government has pooled everything to do with water under one ministry, which has been given the responsibility of managing the nation's water resources. And I think that's a powerful step in the right direction. And the next step could be empowering local communities to manage their own water needs. And the corollary to that would be regeneration of forests. And I think the money exists, the political will exists. And I think that India could lead the world in showing how to do that, especially since we have an abundance of phenomenal entrepreneurs.
Well, speaking of entrepreneurs and speaking of incentives and policy intervention to get an entire industry and a new sector kickstarted, there is an increasing trend away from fossil fuels to electricity as a source for mobility. So if you think about if I were to make a pivot again to the trend towards electric cars and electric vehicles, there's a growing trend in that direction. That said, there are studies that show that alternative propulsion vehicles, which include electric vehicles, hybrids, natural gas vehicles, and others, they have claimed more than 50% of the market in the European Union. So the EU is in many ways at the front of this trend. The question now for Amitabh is, where would you see India in terms of moving away from fossil fuels in all the vehicles that are clogging Indian roadways? And of course, with the emerging middle class, that's one of the first things that people want to go out and get.
So Bhaskar, that's a very important question that you've asked me, and it's important to understand that India will see 500 million Indians getting into the process of urbanization in the next 3 to 4 decades. And you will see a huge amount of urbanization taking place in India. So much of India is yet to be built. And it's important to do that in a manner where, unlike the Western countries, India makes its cities for public transportation and not for individual cars. It's very important that India's new urbanization should be based on very good public transportation rather than individual vehicles. So it's important, and this future of mobility in India should be based on mobility which is common, which is connected, which is congestion free, which is really clean and cutting edge. The second point I want to make is that if you look at India's transportation sector today, almost 75% of it is two-wheeler and three-wheelers and not cars. And therefore, the challenge for India is that make two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and 100 three-wheelers have already gone 100% electric in India, but all two-wheelers must go electric in the next 5 years. That means across India, all two-wheelers must go electric. That's critical. And that is what several schemes like FAME and etc. have done in India. The third, to my mind, is that it's very important that there should be indigenization of this electric process, electric mobility process, because it should not be that we become dependent on external places for lithium supplies. And for the value addition, irrespective of whether nickel, lithium, and cobalt is important, it's possible to do 90%. A separate study has shown that 89% of the value addition can still be done in India, and that's important. The fourth is that this would require a lot of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, they require batteries, and therefore that the advanced chemistry cell manufacturing must be done in India so that the supply chains are adequately domesticated and the value chain are clear. And for this, we've pushed the production-linked incentive scheme, and a lot of new companies have come in which are pushing for battery manufacturing in India. And that is important. The next is that we need to push for electric chargers manufacturing in India, and we need to, which we are doing. All the cities are pushing for electric chargers in a very big way, and therefore you will see a lot of electric charger manufacturing happening in India. And it's also important that we do repurposing and recycling of advanced chemistry cells. So a number of starters have come in which have pushed for this. And therefore, what I foresee in the future is that India, you will see the two-wheelers going 100% electric. You'll see three-wheelers going completely 100% electric. You will see a lot of new models of four-wheelers coming in from the Tatas, Mahindras, and all. Everybody will go in for four-wheelers, which will be electric. You will see India, we just done this bidding of 5,500 electric buses, which demonstrated that you can, on an OPEX basis, the cost of electric buses will be cheaper than combustion vehicles. So you'll see every city, every state of India going in for electric buses. With the pooling of procurement across India for this purpose will push down the prices. As India has done in LED bulbs, the same thing will happen in buses. We'll push down the prices in a very big way. And therefore, the similar trend for electric heavy vehicles, which contribute to about a quarter of our emissions, will also be key. And I believe that the adoption of, as we go along for long distance transport, you'll see green hydrogen play a key role in this regard. So my view is go for new The new urbanization should all be based on public transportation. Two-wheelers, three-wheelers, all should go 100% electric. That is the trend in the next coming year. And the private sector, new factories like Ola have shown these are the world's largest factories, which are all electric, all driven by women manufacturing them. And I believe that India's strategy towards clean mobility will focus on moving people and not moving vehicles, which has happened in the western part of the world. And that will be achieved through very robust public transportation network. And this will be pivotal in decarbonizing the transport sector as a whole.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's fascinating to see many of these developments, several of which you noted. I just wanted to kind of pitch in with a shout out for a company called OHM Mobility, OHM Mobility. I taught a class on innovation models for sustainable business this past spring, and one of the projects that my students did was to work with OHM Mobility to help improve their business model and their innovative capacity. And so they're a classic example of bottom-up entrepreneurship. So basically what they do is they provide clean mobility financing technology to enable electric vehicle businesses access institutional capital. And they have done it through a combination of different innovations. It's not just kind of partnering with the classic financing institutions, but they're also using the Internet of Things to track vehicles, and they're utilizing EVs as a robust and bankable asset class. So there are many different creative approaches that are coming together in the technology sector, in the battery sector, and in the financing sector. So quite fascinating to see all of these developments going on. Back to you, Gaurav.
So electric vehicles, of course, are one of the biggest business trends that we see today. My kids won't buy anything except an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle. However, I have a few questions. So if you look at emissions, including those generated for excavating the rare earth materials and their ultimate disposal, EVs may be less climate friendly than are popularly thought. Toyota, and I think other Japanese companies as well, have an alternative model. So for example, Toyota has a 1-6-90 rule, what they call 1-6-90. They calculate that the raw material needed to make an EV could be used to make 90 plug-in electric hybrid vehicles. And the overall carbon reduction of those 90 hybrid vehicles would be 37 times more than that of a pure EV. Do we see such intermediate models as the sweet spot for the future? This is a question for Dean Kyte.
Well, I think the Toyota story is a really interesting one, and they appointed a new CEO just a few months ago. And in his first major address as the CEO, he seemed to indicate that Toyota was now fully committed to battery electric vehicles, abandoning its decadal journey through hydrogen fuel cells and other forms of hybrid. And I think that when you look at where all its competitors went in terms of full battery electric vehicles and not really pursuing the hybrid model, my read of that was that Toyota believes it's got a lot of catching up to do. That means now, with Toyota's statement that all major car manufacturers in the world are committed to battery electric vehicles, so they must know something. And this means that I think Bloomberg New Energy Finance's estimate, and the interesting thing about Bloomberg New Energy Finance is that they've been more accurate than the International Energy Agency for 17 out of the last 17 years, is that 1 in 3 of all cars will be electric by 2026 globally. Now, of course, there's large parts of the world where there are very few cars. That means that about 42% of the European fleet will be electric, and it means that half of the fleet in China will be electric. So I think the questions are how to as Amitabh said, how to manage this transition to electric mobility in a sustainable way, looking at the value chain, looking at dependencies and security in that value chain, and looking at the minerals and the elements needed in that supply chain. And then also how to keep leapfrogging, especially for those parts of the world which are urbanizing very quickly, where air quality is a significant issue, but where you don't want to just crowd the streets with everybody in their own car. So I think the points about two-wheelers and three-wheelers are very, very important. And there's multiple business models. And this is where the sort of the headline, I think, of our discussion today is so important, because this is obviously India's opportunity to be the provider of both the business models and the actual two-wheelers themselves to the rest of the world, especially when one looks at Africa and how quickly two-wheeler entrepreneurs are moving in Africa, but from a very low base, right? So there's a huge opportunity. I just want to push back a little bit on this emissions. Is a battery vehicle, actually when all in, because of the minerals and everything, because it's heavier, is it actually better than an internal combustion engine vehicle? I think that this is also debunked now quite comprehensively, and I think that I live in the US and I read the US press, and I read the UK press. Not normally good for my blood pressure, but every few weeks there is a story which sort of pulls out the fact that there's no difference really between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine vehicle in terms of emissions. And what they do is they bring out a study that was funded and published by Volvo some years ago, which said that an electric vehicle was going to be 70% higher in its emissions when you took its full life cycle into account. So that report has now been pulled to pieces by countless other studies. And I think that what we're looking at is that for over the full life cycle of an electric vehicle, most of them are about two-thirds less in emissions than an internal combustion engine. And for and then people say, well, what about a hydrogen? And there I think it's a hydrogen vehicle is about 30% less than a internal combustion engine. The other thing about hydrogen, and of course I talked about Toyota, is that there's only about 72,000 hydrogen vehicles on the planet, whereas there's about 1.5 billion electric vehicles. And so again, I think we've got scale. So the future is going to be electric. The batteries are improving. You're going to have, I think, a generation of batteries which will last the lifetime of the vehicle in a very short period of time. At the moment, we know that the batteries, for example, in a Prius, a Toyota Prius taxi in Fiji, that the problem is that those are second-hand Priuses and their batteries run out after about 8 to 9 years, posing a waste problem for a country like Fiji. But I think where we're headed is an improvement in battery technology. And of course, some of the business models around electric vehicles are about renting out the battery or as well as just purchasing the vehicle. So I think that the future is electric. The future is also people movers in cities. It isn't all about every family having a car. I think that's also about the aspirations and the mindset and the norms for future generations. What they want is access to mobility. They don't necessarily want to own a vehicle. And I think this is one of the areas where the future generations will choose for themselves a new norm of travel. And it's our responsibility to put the policy in place to make sure that that's clean.
Gaurav, can I come in on that for a minute?
Yes, please.
Gaurav, it's very, very important to understand this, that we are passing through a moment when we should never go in for technologies which will not allow us to, technologically, pole vaulting is very necessary in India. And we should not go in for technologies which are outdated or which are interim technologies. As was rightly said by the Dean, the future is electric. If you look around, sales of passenger electric vehicles have increased by almost 60% in 2022. And despite very flat global auto market sales, the electric vehicle market has risen in India by 200%, in Japan and China by 100%, in Australia by 90%, and there is a declining market for internal combustion vehicles everywhere. The second point I want to make is that hybrid technology will take India back. While I have the greatest regard for Japanese technologies, hybrid technology is not a technology for the future. India, like it has done in mobile telephony, must pole vault technologically. And therefore, my view is that the power sector is also continuing to decarbonize, and by 2050, it'll be more than 80% zero carbon. And electric vehicles' energy input will keep getting cleaner every year. By 2050, more than 3/4 of all driving will be electric vehicles, and power that tops them will be 4/5 zero emission. And therefore, we need not worry. This is the future. What the Dean has said is very right. The future is electric. We should be single-mindedly focused on going electric as far as two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and four-wheelers are concerned. As far as buses are concerned, my view is that long-distance transport will be over a long period of time driven by green hydrogen, because battery swapping will be very tough and difficult on buses. But we should not mix up interim technologies and emerging technologies, which are technologies of the future. Therefore, India needs to technologically pole vault and not adopt interim technologies.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Amitabh. I know that we are getting to a point where we'd like to open this up for wider questions from the audience. I also know that Rachel has to leave for another meeting, and I had promised her that I will now lob the softball or underarm bowling question, the easy question before she has to jump. And so the easy question, this is for Rachel, this is for Amitabh, this is for William, all three of you, but perhaps I'll ask Rachel to respond first, which is, it has to do with the issue at the global level, the global roundtable, we call it COP, and repeatedly at the end of every COP, people wait with bated breath as to, what's the document that everybody has sort of signed up for. And invariably, there's a tug, there's a push and pull between the developed world and the developing world. And we've touched upon this in the earlier observations. The bottom 100 countries, if you were to rank all the countries by, on the league table of greenhouse gas emissions, the bottom 100 countries account for only 3% of the world's greenhouse gases. So they're kind of saying, hey, wait a minute, why are we being asked to, kind of make changes, given that we have a long way to go in terms of making, using our carbon quota in order to develop? And why are we being asked to cut back earlier? Now, India stands at an interesting position, right? Because it is a developing country. And as we noted earlier, its per capita emissions is indeed much lower, but it is part of the club of the three largest emitters. And it is currently the fastest growing large economy in the world, which means more emissions and lots of growth in terms of emissions. So I guess the question is, how do we resolve this debate and not have to keep going back COP after COP, waiting? It's kind of like the debt ceiling crisis in the United States. It just, it seems like a Greek tragedy just keeps playing out over and over again. Is there a light at the end of that tunnel? Perhaps, Rachel, you can lead us off first.
Okay, well, I mean, as a British citizen, I'm always very nervous of a googly from an Indian down the pitch, and so I'll try and hit that with a reverse swing. So so I think we're at the point of diminishing returns in the way in which climate negotiations take place. That poses a political dilemma for the United Nations, but also I think for all countries. I mean, today, the intersessional negotiations finish in Bonn, and it took them 8 out of 9 days to be able to agree the agenda for the meeting, which just shows you that, and of course, countries point at each other and different blocs point at each other, but at the end of the day, we're all responsible for this, and this can't go on. Meanwhile, right, the good news is that everybody understands that it's in their own vested interest to grow, that their competitiveness, that their ability to protect their own people, to protect their own security is going to come from mastering these transitions towards net zero. And I think there are enough sensible people in each country to understand that we need every country to be able to do that. So climate has now become, a prevailing issue for the G20, for the G7, for the Security Council of the UN, etc. Now, are these institutions established in a way that would make sense for this particular crisis at this particular time in the 21st century? No, they're legacy institutions founded in the middle of the last century and represent, who thought they were in charge then. And so there is a long-term agenda around institutional reform, but there are short and medium-term agendas around releasing the funds that are trapped within the system and that are available into what we need them to do. And so I think that for the high emitting countries, they have a responsibility, but also they have a pressing need in terms of their own growth to work their way through these transitions. And for low income and vulnerable countries, there is an international responsibility to help them. What's happened this year is that we've got a breakthrough in the conversation around having to resolve the structural issues for those low-income countries, which relate to the cost of capital, the growing indebtedness, the models that we've been using for the last 70-odd years about having to borrow in order to be able to invest in your own resilience. That which is encapsulated in what we call the Bridgetown Initiative, and which will be the subject for discussion at a summit that about 45 heads of state are expected to go to in Paris next week, is the beginning of a fusing of our economic system and our financial system actually have to work for this crisis of inclusion and an equity and a crisis of climate. And so can we in the short term do? Yes, of course we can do short-term things. Short-term things include making sure that the people who are causing the problem actually pay a levy on that. So, if you think about air travel, right? So, well over 50% of the people in this world have never been on a plane. Of the 50% who have ever been on a plane, most of them have only ever been on a plane once. The people who cause the problem are people like me, business travelers, going to international climate conferences. No, but seriously, are the 1% of the 1%. So if we put a levy on business class air travel, that raises a substantial amount of money that could go into supporting resilience in low-income countries. You will see a big push next week in Paris around levies on point-to-point marine transport. This is actually coming from the marine industry itself. This would help fund the move to green bunker fuels. It would also be available as a fund into the lowest income. And then finally, I'd say that the UAE, who are hosting the climate talks and who've attracted significant criticism because of a failure to explain how they will run their presidency and separately from how they will run their state-owned oil company and their economy, they're very conscious of the fact that for countries like the UAE, which again didn't cause the problem, but is now a major provider of fossil fuels which do cause the problem, that there is opportunity for countries like that to invest in private sector development and solutions to climate change outside of the traditional system, where it becomes very political, who owns what shares and who controls which institution, but that new pockets of finance coming from non-traditional donors would actually be able to have significant influence in terms of how they leverage the rest of the institutions. So I think the short-term things to be done, medium-term things to be done, and in the long term, the institutions need to reflect the world that we live in.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Amitabh, in the immediate term, you are in the thick of G20, and the presidency of the G20 potentially creates an opportunity to have this discussion in a direct and honest way. And I'm curious about your perspectives on this question.
Well, Bhaskar, my view is that of the available carbon space in the 1.5 degree carbon centigrade scenario, developed countries of today have accounted for the bulk of the emissions. Irrespective of that, irrespective of the fact that we are home to 17% of the global population and our per capita incomes are less than a third of the world's average, we must take the lead, and emerging markets also must take a lead. And we are the world's fifth largest economy. We continue to be the fastest growing large economy. The demand for energy in India is intensifying. By the end of the decade, we are expected to become the third largest economy. And my view is that going green is actually net positive. And therefore, the more we go green, we'll add more and more value. Our private enterprise will be able to attract values. They will be able to attract capital as they go green. So it makes business sense to go green. And therefore, the developed world needs to be cognizant of the fact that while they have left very little carbon space for the rest of the world, they must assist the rest of the world, particularly the emerging markets, from where most of the growth will come. They have not lived up to this commitment of $100 billion a year, which they'd made in 2009 at Copenhagen. But irrespective of that fact, they must ensure that private capital flows into these countries in a very big way. And this would require a huge amount of reform of the multilateral institutions, because the sheer size of investment required, not just in India, but all developing countries, means that private capital must be mobilized in a very big way. And risk mitigation strategies to incentivize climate-friendly investments in developing economies must be developed. They must be used to unlock private investment. That is really the key. And I've been a long-term believer that there will be upcoming clean energy technologies. I think India will become the center of global production of green hydrogen because it is climatically blessed. It has the enterprise of private sector to drive this production. The cost of green hydrogen right now is $4.5 per kilogram. India should be able to bring it down to $2.5 in the next 2 to 3 years and bring it down to $1 per kilogram by 2030. The important thing is that countries like United States are pursuing a policy of protectionism through the Inflation Reduction Act, to say that I will only subsidize green hydrogen which is made in the United States and not allow not allow imports of green hydrogen or ammonia to come in from other parts of the world, will actually retard the process of new technologies, particularly green hydrogen. It will impact new projects in Australia, Korea, India, many other places. And therefore, it's important that there should be no protectionism, particularly from developed part of the world in new technologies which are going to push for clean energy technologies. And therefore, this is important. This is a very, very important point because IRA is very protectionist in character. And from an Indian viewpoint, I'm very confident that India's potential in supporting global green hydrogen economy will be immense. And with the abundance of low-cost solar, wind, and biomass resources, and betting on the success of India's renewable energy market, I believe that we will champion the development of a robust global hydrogen economy, and actually India will become a green hydrogen exporter in the years to come. So I believe that we should very, very confidently push for clean technologies. We should push for private sector play. We should push for much greater level of resources flowing in from multilateral institutions. The transformation will not take place only on the balance sheet of multilateral financial institutions. Their balance sheet should be the global balance sheet. It's important to understand this. And that means that a lot of indirect instruments like blended finance and first loss guarantees, etc., must come into play in the years to come.
So that's an interesting perspective, Amitabh. Multilaterals looking at a global balance sheet. The IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act, the balance sheet that politicians look at is the political balance sheet, right? And that often drives decisions. And of course, politics is an important component of decisions made in the United States, in India, in China, and everywhere else. But you rightly pointed to the role of the private sector, private capital, private initiative, private entrepreneurship, social enterprise. So I'd love to get some perspective from the private sector, from William. You are at the thick of this. So how do you see the debate being resolved, coming at it from a private and social enterprise perspective?
So, Bhaskar, one of the things that's been exciting is to see the shift in private funding sources towards ESG. It's early days right now, and there's a lot of greenwashing going on. But with all these things, suboptimality is par for the course. There will be a lot of suboptimality, but it's encouraging to see. The Norwegians have committed their entire sovereign fund, which is close to, I think, 1.5 trillion of assets under management, to ESG causes. Some of the largest US pools of capital, notwithstanding certain political pressure they're facing in the US, have made a very, very strong commitment to supporting ESG type of businesses. ESG businesses are longer gestation businesses where the return on capital takes longer. You need to measure them on multiple axes, not just on profit, but return on capital is certainly one of them. But I would say, social equity created by the enterprise. I would add environmental benefits of the enterprise, and of course, the type of product that the enterprise produces. So if you add these additional three variables to the mix of just pure profit and return on capital, ESG enterprises that follow this are going to find that India is a very, very good place to invest. Whenever I feel depressed about the world, I listen to Amitabh, and I feel instantly optimistic about all the great things that are happening, because there is really so much good that is happening, especially in the country. And there's so many entrepreneurs who've made a very serious commitment to building a different ecosystem. But what the critical missing ingredient in that ecosystem right now is funding, because the conventional private equity model that has worked for a long time is not a good model to support ESG style businesses. And I think that government incentives, I know Amitabh's heard me say this many times, but just for the benefit of this audience, I'm going to say that, if governments were to recognize a standard for ESG businesses, one that could evaluate ESG businesses and, then give them a score, and then basis that score, certain tax incentives could be given, that would immediately shift the balance. Because right now, an ESG business struggles to get financing. There are a few outstanding individuals like Vineet Rai, the founder of Avishkar. Vineet Rai is an exceptional human being who's done a very courageous thing. He was created India's first ESG fund. There are many others, like the Impact Investment Council of India under Ram Rajpai, another incredible institution. But the interesting thing is that if the government were to make some very minor tweaks to the law, it would release a flood of ESG money into areas where development would be accelerated: organic agriculture, seed banks, areas that are real priorities for the government today, and wisely so that they have picked these priority areas. And just a small creating a scorecard, because today in the US, you have the B Corp, and I'm amazed that every time I come to the US, I see the number of companies that are now proudly carrying the B Corp label. The B Corp is an excellent standard, but it is one focused on the West. We need a similar standard for the developing world. And I think that India will once again, show the way and come up with such a standard. And if we are able to do that, it would be a sea change across Asia and Africa.
Absolutely. Well said, William. I think the notion of a B Corp in the setting standards coming from India and the developing world would be very important. In fact, even metrics of how one rates ESG could come from India and the developing world, given that we made a mess of it in the developed world. There is no agreement between different ESG metrics providers, which adds to the challenges that we are facing here, and also some of the politicization of ESG, which of course is a
But
topic for
Bhaskar,
another
the new B Corp standards as they've evolved, and Andrew Cassoy has been at the forefront of the B Corp revolution. I mean, he's the founder, one of the founders of B Corp. I mean, the new B Corp standards are very well suited to the US. They're very well suited to Europe. They're very well suited to any developed economy. What we need is the Indian equivalent of the standard. And I'm sure something like that will come soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agreed. We have a rapidly diminishing time. So I do want to, provide some time for audience questions. So here's a question from Nayan Seth. And the question is, one of the key priorities for India as the G20 chair, and I suspect, Amitabh, you're the one who's going to pick this up. The key priorities as the G20 chair is to push for women-led development. And women participation in the workforce in India in both formal and informal sectors was abysmally low in 2022, down from 27% in 2005 to 23.5% in 2022. So the question from Nayan is, why do you think female work participation is dropping, and what specific policy steps are being taken by the government to reverse the trend?
So the important thing is that to this question, that the government is pushing for women-led development in a very big way across sectors. And what it has done is to ensure that we are able to open, India has built about close to about 40 million houses in the last 7-8 years. And 80% of these houses are in the name of women. When we started the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, only 19% of the bank accounts were in the name of women. Today, about 86% of the women have bank accounts. So during the COVID period, we could provide assistance and support to all the women. Similarly, 100 million LPG connections, so you could provide a good, clean form of energy to women. So whatever scheme or mudra loans, if you look at it, which is for starting your own enterprise, 70% of the lending has gone to women. Now, one of the key reasons has been that a lot of women who were earlier taking to jobs are now going in for education in a much bigger way. And the second is that much of India's women employment is in the informal sector, which doesn't get captured. But that's no excuse. I think the important aspect for India is to push for better nutrition for women, to improve the learning outcomes, to improve health outcomes, to ensure that we are able to provide grassroots level better entrepreneurship to women. We are able to bridge the digital divide, so there's a technological leapfrogging, and that there should be a huge amount of transfer of wealth from men to women in the coming years. One of the studies by the World Economic Forum has said that it will take 132 years to achieve gender parity between men and women across the world. We don't have 132 years. We need to do this within one generation, and that would require us to actually push a lot of what India is doing is to push a lot of that transformation within this. And last 7 to 8 years, a huge amount of transformation of this has been done, and we'll continue to do this. We strongly believe that in India, women will be very critical players. We must put them into position of powers. We must put them into all the panchayats. We must make them drive India's economy. And we must ensure that during G20's presidency, it's not just about gender empowerment, but about women-led development. And we'll put our full force and energy behind that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Amitabh. I have a question from my colleague, Kim Wilson, and she seems to be experiencing some dissonance in what she's hearing. So she asked the question both for William and for Amitabh. So she asks, William, you said we need a new post-Bretton Woods system to better align resources and incentives. And Amitabh, you say that the current institutions can be restructured. So her question is, which is it? New institutions or restructuring old institutions?
I think Amitabh has wisdom on this, and I think he should answer this. So this is a tough question.
No. So my view is that if you new institutions right now will be impossible, given that there's a lack of political will. There's a fractured will. We must understand the political reality of the world, that the 1/3 of the world is in recession. 75 countries of the world are facing a global debt crisis. Post-COVID, 200 million people have gone below the poverty line. 100 million people have lost their jobs. There is a lack of a political will to create new institutions. That will take an enormously long time. It's not a feasible, practically, realistically, it's not a feasible proposition right now. You need to restructure, redesign the existing institutions for the world of today. And that means that these institutions, the World Bank should become an instrument for financing SDG and climate finance. And IMF should look after global economy. They are doing everything but looking at the global economy. That's very important. They must understand that inflation is impacting emerging markets. They must understand that interest rates are impacting emerging markets, that resources today are flowing from emerging markets to the developed world rather than vice versa. And whereas the growth will all come from emerging markets in the coming years. And similarly, World Bank must push for indirect lending. There's no shortage of resources, as I said. $350 trillion are available. It's not the balance sheet of World Bank will be very inadequate. What the World Bank must leverage is the global balance sheet to allow vast resources of the private sector to flow in. Therefore, my view is that first loss guarantees, credit enhancement, blended finance is the only way for them to finance emerging markets. If resources do not flow into emerging markets, it will be a tragedy. It'll be sad that SDGs and climate finance will get impacted, and therefore global growth will get impacted. And if global growth gets impacted, then inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth will be impacted. And that would mean that global poverty and climate change will get impacted in a very big way. And that's the challenge, that redesign, completely restructure these institutions for today's world.
William, I'll give you an opportunity to make the case for new institutions.
Just a small, Amitabh lives in the real world of what is possible and what is doable, given the global leadership that we have around the world, who he knows and meets with. The Marshall Plan was set up after the Second World War and I believe it's one of the things that really saved Europe. It was a fund created with the sole purpose of rebuilding Europe. Just as a policy program, I think it was one of the most successful things the US has done in the second half of the 20th century. I think it's one of the most laudable and underappreciated initiatives. But I think it's time for leaders in the world. And I think that part of the problem is the new world leadership has to include India and China and the US. Maybe some of the Second World War powers that were included immediately after the war, there needs to be a rethink on the players that are in these global forums. And I think there needs to be a sitting down and with initiatives to how do we create or tweak our current institutions, or not tweak is not the word, radically re-engineer our current institutions, as Amitabh is saying, and make them, appropriate for the world we live in today with its challenges. Because otherwise these institutions are really going to become dinosaurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are glad that we have a good friend, Ajay Banga, now trying to infiltrate those institutions and perhaps restructure it and reimagine it. Gaurav, you've been quiet for a while. You obviously, many of the questions that we had, you have perspectives on them as well. In these waning minutes, in fact, we have already waned, but I wanted to, give you the opportunity to offer some reflections on what you heard today, other ideas, and questions that you wish we had asked.
Well, I'm optimistic that the path we are on, we will tackle the climate challenge. Now, the empirical evidence is, if you go back to London just after the Industrial Revolution, transportation was provided by horses. And there was pollution, there were all sorts of challenges. And then came the automotive cycle. And the problems of horses and the pollution that was created because of smoke and everything else at that time during the Industrial Revolution went away. when you were in that moment, frozen in that moment, we couldn't imagine that such radical change could happen. So I do believe adoption of technology, and in the climate challenge, we have to really adopt technology. I think we will win this battle. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, and when you say technology, I'm assuming you have kind of a whole slate of technologies in mind.
I mean, technologies in general,
Yeah.
from all sides, from the electricity side, from the automotive side, from the chemical side.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew Halsey writes that as these new technologies are being rapidly developed, is there a robust discussion and energy being spent on potential unintended consequences of these technologies? So, of course, we are kind of living through this most recent burst of obsession with AI, and simultaneously, as everybody's excited about the direction of AI, people are concerned about, the unintended consequences of what we might have unleashed. Of course, to even scratch the surface of that question and what lies beyond, we would need not just another 90 minutes, but perhaps 90 sessions. But unfortunately, we will have to wrap here. Speaking of technology, our next episode in this symposium series is going to be on technology, and specifically on the question of digital public infrastructure, which has been one of the areas where if one points to something that India has really made a distinctive contribution in, of course, distinctive contributions in many areas, but this is the one area that has sort of sparked a lot of interest and imagination, both within the country and beyond. So we are going to be talking on about that subject next. Please keep a lookout for the dates and times. We thank everybody for joining us in this conversation. This is, of course, the start of a conversation, and unfortunately ended because there's only limited time, and especially the limited time of three very significantly time-challenged individuals: Amitabh Kant, William Bissell, Gaurav Dalmia, and a fourth one, Rachel Kyte, who her time was even more limited as she had to jump on the next in the next meeting. Really, thank you from all of us at the Fletcher School for participating in this conversation. We look forward to extending this discussion with you in the coming months, and we will have an in-person gathering in 2024 where we'll bring many of these topics together, and we hope to see everybody there. So thank you so much, and from the Fletcher School in Medford, Massachusetts, and from beautiful Boston, I'm wishing you all the very best, and good evening to those of you in India, and a good day to everybody else in the United States.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bhaskar.